Excellent. Welcome, everybody. We will have a few more folks trickling in, but I want to formally welcome you all to Shoreline's Community Climate Conversations. This is the third Community Climate Conversation, and we'll be meeting tonight from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll be diving into both buildings and energy, as well as consumption and waste during our conversation tonight. I do want to note that we will be recording the presentation portion of tonight's meeting to post on the project website for those that weren't able and aren't able to join us for tonight's conversation. And now I'll be turning it over to Brent, our IT manager, for just a moment and a really quick tutorial on how to enable live transcript, if you would like to do so. Brent?
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen. So if you would like to see this closed captioning for what we are saying in real time, if you click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to show subtitle, and we'll start seeing the words that people are saying show up. If you would like to change the size of those letters, you can go down to subtitle settings and change those settings, and then the words will get bigger or smaller. So if you have trouble with it, you can chat me in the chat, and I will try to help you on the back end.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brent. And for those that just joined, that is if you would like to enable live transcript. Excellent. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. As we get started tonight, we would like you to pause for just a moment and take a moment to rename yourself with your first name and the neighborhood that you live in, if you'd like to do that. So in order to rename yourself, you click the participant bar. So you'll need to see the participant bar there. Click participants, hover over your name, click the more option, and then click rename. And once you've done that, please use the Zoom chat to answer the following icebreaker that you see on the screen. What is something that you do in your personal life to reduce your carbon footprint from energy consumption or waste generation? So feel free, when you've got a response to that, to go right into the chat and share your response. We've got from Tracy, from Lake Forest Park, buy only second-hand clothes, from Teresa from Richmond Highlands, thrift items, from Kami, I hope I'm saying that right, from Highland Terrace, buy bulk. From Semra from Lake Forest Park, primarily drive, use electric vehicles, upgrade insulation in my home, or upgraded insulation in my home. From Todd from Richmond Highlands, buy used things, Craigslist mostly. From Keithan, turn off all the hallway lights in my office. I am often the last one to leave. From Courtney from Richland Highlands, walk instead of drive, consolidate car trips. From Rebecca, all electric house with heat pump. From Trina, walk for most chores and keep heat under 68 in the winter. From Leah, repair rather than replace. From Will, composting, gardening. From Kara, walk whenever I can, buy used. From Jeff, drive electric car, have a worm bin. From Diane, drive as little as possible, no flying, have a heat pump. Water heater, all electric house. From Teresa, use buy nothing group to give away and acquire things. From Kathan, I just got a Tesla, so looking forward to no more gas. From Amaya, reduce and reuse things. From Lisa, do not online shop. Love, recycle. Compost and gardening, yelled the kids to turn off the lights. Installed a level 2 charger. Buy nothing, just exchange. So a lot of tips and tricks here that you all are doing in your daily life, using cold water, purchasing everything used. As more ideas come to you, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So this slide shares our workshop purpose as well as how we're going to get there. So our roadmap for tonight's conversation. So our purpose for the conversation tonight is to review the climate action planning process. So in just a moment, I'll be turning it over to Cameron Reed, who will be doing just that. We'll also share a quick recap of the feedback that we received from Community Climate Conversation number 2. Sharing the goals for Community Climate Conversations 3, which is tonight, as well as our upcoming one in just a couple of weeks. We'll also be sharing and introducing to you all proposed buildings and energy and consumption and waste strategies and actions. And these really are two separate presentations that Cameron will be sharing with you all on the strategies and actions for both of these focus areas. And then we'll be pausing actually between each of these for a question and answer period as well, recognizing that there's a lot of content that we'll be sharing with you all tonight. And then we'll be diving into breakout rooms to get your reactions, responses, hear from you all in terms of your priorities and preferences as we look at these strategies and actions more closely. Any questions on the agenda, whether the meeting purpose or the agenda for tonight? I'll just pause for a brief moment. All right, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We've got a Zoom poll. We've got two different, as I just mentioned, we've got these two different categories and focus areas that we're calling them tonight, buildings and energy, as well as consumption and waste. And in just a moment, we'll be asking you to fill out a Zoom poll. And this poll will be asking whether you have a preference for a focus area breakout room. So if you'd like to go to the buildings and energy strategies and actions breakout room, or if you'd like to go to the consumption and waste breakout room. And each of these breakout rooms will be looking at the strategies and actions related to that particular focus area. The other option is either is fine and you don't have a preference, but we'd really like to assign people to the focus area that either most closely aligns with your interests or with your area of expertise and area that you'd like to dive into more deeply. So Haley, let me know when we're all set to launch that Zoom poll, and you'll see it on your screen. And then if you could just take a moment to answer the question, let us know what breakout room you'd like to be in.
Hey Gretchen, can we actually come back to that? We're doing some troubleshooting.
Oh, great. Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
We will come back to that. The breakout rooms are after the presentation, so we may do that right before we head into the breakout rooms. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Great. And so with that, I'll be turning it over to Cameron Reed. Cameron Reed is the Environmental Services Program Manager for the City of Shoreline. Cameron.
Thanks so much, Gretchen, and good to see all of you. Thanks for spending your Wednesday evening here with us on Zoom when it's still nice outside. So really appreciate you all being here. And I just want to provide a quick overview of the Climate Action Plan update process that we're in the middle of. That's the reason for tonight's event before we dive into these focus areas related to buildings and waste a little more specifically. So next slide, please, Alicia. So the Shoreline Climate Action Plan, really, as you know, climate change is already impacting us here and communities around the world. In Shoreline, specifically, we're seeing this in the form of more extreme heat events, lower air quality from more frequent wildfires, and changing winter storm patterns that both increase the flood risk in winter and the drought risk in summer. And it's just important to keep in mind as well that more catastrophic impacts are being felt by communities around the world that are often less insulated or have less resources to adapt. Now, the City of Shoreline, we created our first climate action plan back in 2013. And since then, we've completed many of the recommendations from that plan and have made some progress in reducing overall emissions. However, the recent science is clear that we have a narrow window of opportunity, really over the next decade, to take transformative action if we are to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So for this climate action plan, we are really looking to identify key transformative actions that the city can take to, one, drastically reduce our community-wide emissions, and those fall into a couple of the focus areas we'll be talking about tonight. So transportation is one, buildings, waste and consumption is another. But we can't just work on reducing emissions now. We also need to prepare our community and ensure that people are protected from the impacts that are already here and those that are projected to continue to get worse, and focus on the most vulnerable. So we'll have a preparedness and resilience focus area as well. And lastly, we want to support our ecosystems and especially our urban forests so that we can continue to so that they can continue to remove carbon from the atmosphere, storing it in trees and soils, and also continue to provide the host of other social and ecosystem benefits that they provide. And so we'll have an ecosystems and sequestration, sort of a natural climate solutions focus area. And last but not least, we want to focus and center equity in the climate action plan. We know that some community members, especially those that face current or historic inequities and systemic racism, also often experience the earliest and most acute impacts of climate change and may have limited resources or capacity to adapt to those impacts. Next slide, please. In terms of where we are in this process, so we have been working, really started back in 2020 to work on a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So that was completed last year. Also last year, what is kind of listed as phase 1 here, we assembled a group of community climate advisors from diverse backgrounds and life experiences to help us frame the update and provide early feedback. We also hosted a community climate conversation event in November to establish a vision and priorities for the plan. And now we are in what we're calling phase 2 here. So we've been working with staff and partners over the past months to develop the list of strategies and actions which we are presenting in this 3-part series. And each event looking at a different focus area. So 2 weeks ago was transportation, tonight is buildings and waste. And in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the resilience and sequestration areas. And we recognize, we've broken these out by topic, but really a lot of them are interrelated, so not just siloed. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Gretchen to recap kind of where we've been.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. So as Cameron mentioned, this project is in 3 phases, and we've got community climate conversations planned for each of the 3 phases. So on the project timeline, you did see those 3 phases. And during phase 1, we held a community climate conversation to gather input from the community on overarching vision, on priorities, on concerns related to the CAP update. We are currently in phase 2 and in the 3rd community climate conversation overall. 2 weeks ago, we held a conversation to discuss draft strategies and actions related to transportation. And 2 weeks from now, we'll be hosting our 4th community conversation and last conversation of this phase to discuss sequestration and resilience. And in the summer, during phase 3, we will review the draft CAP with you all to get feedback and input from the community before it's packaged into the final product. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we wanted to share with you before we dive into our conversation tonight, we did want to share with you some of the feedback that we heard in the most recent conversation, included hearing, so some of the things that we included hearing concerns about some of the draft actions, which largely included equity considerations about the cost of EVs. So that came up at various points in our previous climate conversation, as well as functionality concerns about the lack of sidewalks and shoreline affecting walkability actions and different functionality issues that arise from both bike and scooter share programs. Gaps in the draft action list were identified, including a need for traffic calming actions, as well as improving shoreline sidewalks. We also heard that the actions that promoted multimodal transportation, the most equitable and accessible actions, and the actions that do not rely on financial means from shoreline residents were the ones that were most supported overall. And if you're interested, but you weren't able to attend the workshop, as we mentioned, we are recording this workshop. We also recorded the previous workshop, and that recording will soon be available online at Shoreline's project website. And at the end of this presentation, we'll be sharing the link to that website in the chat. And the meeting summary from the previous meeting will also be up there as well. So if you want to get caught up that way, the project website is the best place to go. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We did want to mention in just a moment, I'm going to turn it back over to Cameron Reed, who will be diving into the content for tonight's discussion. And at any time, if you've got a question, we do have a designated Q&A portion of this conversation, both at the end of his first presentation and at the end of his second presentation. As I mentioned, a lot of content, and want to give you all a bit of a content break to ask any questions that are related to what you just heard before we move into the next set of content. So, but at any time, if you have a question, please enter it in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and when we get to the Q&A portion of the night for each of the presentations, then we'll be looking back at the chat and responding to all the questions that you all have. If you also, the hand raise function, if you'd like to verbally share your question as well during that Q&A time, then we'll be taking both verbal questions as well as questions that were put in the chat. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Cameron to do our deep dive into buildings and energy and shoreline. Cameron?
Great, thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, next slide, please. So before we dive into buildings specifically, just want to take a step back and talk about the overall emissions. For those of you, we went over this a little more in depth in our first event back in November, but it's been a while. So this graph shows our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions from shoreline direct emissions since 2009. And so you can see that we've had about a 5% decrease since that time, despite population growth. So that's an accomplishment, but we are not on track to meet our targets. And last fall, we updated our targets based on the best available science to really reflect the level of emissions reduction needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And these new targets, I think if you click one more time, Alicia, they'll pop up there. Yeah. So they're even more ambitious. And so it calls for a 60% reduction in community-wide emissions by 2030 and a net zero or 95% reduction no later than 2050. And so this really just shows that, you know, we need to be even more ambitious and transformative if we are going to do our fair share of preventing the worst consequences of climate change. Next slide, please. And so diving in and talking about buildings specifically. So why talk about buildings? Buildings are the second single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in shoreline energy use in buildings. So that's second to transportation, which is just over almost 60%. Buildings come in at 45%. And these are, note just that these are direct emissions, so it doesn't include the impact of the production of goods and services that we consume. And in sort of the, not the teal color, but the lighter greens, those are the building emissions by fuel type. In shoreline, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we have three primary fuel types, and they have a very different climate footprint. So the first there and the largest single source is from the burning of natural gas. So that's, you know, you're directly burning fossil fuel, largely that's space and water heating, but some cooking, you know, like with a gas range. So that's 38% of shoreline's total climate footprint. Natural gases in shoreline is provided by Puget Sound Energy. And just wanted to note there's also indoor and outdoor air quality concerns associated with the use of natural gas. Second is heating oil. So this is, again, you know, directly burning a fossil fuel for heat. And this is primarily occurring in homes. And it's provided by a number of different companies, and it represents about 3% of all emissions in shoreline. Typically, it is also less efficient than other heating types. And just by contrast, so all of the electricity generated for shoreline and consumed in shoreline produced only 3% of shoreline's total greenhouse gas emissions footprint. As I'm sure you're also aware, our electricity comes from Seattle City Light, and they've committed to 100% carbon neutral electricity. So from an emissions perspective, switching from one of these fossil fuel, you know, heating sources or fossil fuel appliance to an efficient electric option is going to have a huge impact. And then there's also some fugitive emissions, which is really sort of leakage from the conveyance system for natural gas. And also just to note that, you know, why buildings, from a strictly emissions perspective, buildings are super important from an equity standpoint. If we think about, you know, affordability, We think about a lot of the older either single family homes or apartment buildings that may be less efficient, meaning that those residents are paying a higher percentage of their income on heating and energy use. And then also the concerns related to indoor air quality that I mentioned associated with natural gas use. And so next slide, please. Let's take a quick look at what types of buildings these are coming from. Combining all those three fuels, we can see how it breaks out by sector. So the largest slice in shoreline, and this is probably different than it is in Seattle or other communities where you have more larger buildings, more commercial or more industrial. For us in shoreline, it is primarily residential homes, right? So the primarily natural gas use in single family homes. And then the commercial and industrial categories, that's how the utility data is broken out. But we're really talking about those larger commercial buildings and larger multifamily buildings. So that would be 40% there. Next slide, please. There has been increasing efforts at the local, county, and state levels to reduce emissions from buildings. So just wanted to highlight a couple of these as context. So here in Shoreline, when we rezoned the areas around the light rail stations, we also mandated that the new development that is, denser and oriented around transit, which that in and of itself is a key strategy in terms of reducing emissions, especially transportation emissions. But we also required that the buildings built in those areas meet high green standards that are above what is required currently in the rest of our code and development standards. So that's in 2017, we created what's we call the Deep Green Incentive Program in addition to that mandate. So it's required that buildings in the station areas hit certain levels of green building. And some of the main certifications there would be Built Green, Salmon Safe, LEED, and Passive House. And it's tiered. But for elsewhere in the city, outside the station areas, it's an incentive. So if buildings hit these different levels of green building, then they receive different development benefits, such as reduced permit fees. Another significant area of advancement has been the Washington State Energy Code, which has the goal of becoming increasingly efficient with each update and of reaching zero fossil fuel emission homes and buildings by 2031. And we're currently in the midst of that next update, and we work closely with staff from other cities through a number of regional groups to continue to push for more efficient and decarbonized buildings. However, because of state law, the way it's set up, we can only adopt local amendments that go beyond the state codes in terms of efficiency or decarbonization, only for commercial and larger multifamily buildings, so those over 4 stories. But we can't require anything beyond what is in the state code for single family residential homes. And so to this end, just back in December, we passed a fossil fuel ban for commercial and multifamily buildings. So that's new commercial and multifamily buildings over 4 stories in Shoreline. And then on the existing building side, so those 2 items apply mostly to new buildings. So for existing buildings at the state level in 2019, we passed in Washington the Clean Buildings Act, which will require very large buildings, so those over 50,000 square feet, to measure their energy use and take steps to improve in efficiency if they're over certain benchmarks. And it's phased in, it really starts in about 2026. And starts with the larger buildings and works down to that 50,000 square foot range. The city of Seattle implemented a similar ordinance much earlier, and it goes further, requires benchmarking for smaller buildings down to 20,000 square feet. So that's about the size of Highland Ice Arena for context. And they also require tune-ups. So if the buildings are not, if they're above the efficiency benchmarks, then they have to implement retrofits to increase efficiency. And also on the existing building side, King County just last year passed the CPACER legislation, which is a super long government acronym, Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resilience. But it's a new program that allows longer term loans that stay with the commercial building instead of with the property owner. So this basically allows and provides financing for a host of different kinds of retrofits with little upfront cost to the building owners. So some of the things it could cover would be electrification, so replacing fossil fuels with electric heat, but it also includes water and energy efficiency, renewable energy generation, EV charging infrastructure, and also seismic hardening, fire safety, and flood related improvements. So this is a great tool for existing commercial buildings and shoreline. And last but not least, Seattle City Light and PSE offer resources, including limited rebates for home and business energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So where has all this got us? This is what we call a wedge analysis. So this is a forecast or a projection of emissions from 2019 through 2050 based on population growth for shoreline specifically. And you can see that dotted line at the top, how high emissions would be by 2050 if we did nothing. But the bold colored bands there represent some of the actions that I mentioned that we have already taken both at the state, the federal, or the local level here. And the text might be a little small, so we'll send this out afterwards for sure. But essentially the top three, the orange colors, are building related. So that's the top is the Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act, which has a smaller impact in shoreline. The Washington State Energy Code improvements, which I mentioned. And then the bold colored orange is the fossil fuel ban I mentioned. The green are transportation actions. And then the blue really is that emissions gap of what we need to take additional action on at all levels of society, but including through the climate action plan here. And so if you click one more time, Alicia. So this is kind of looking at that same graph from a different perspective, breaking it out by the sources of those emissions. And again, the highlight here is the green is transportation, but then that orange on top is natural gas use. So you can see that's still one of the single biggest sources. The light tan kind of down at the bottom is heating oil, and the brown that tapers off by 2030 is electricity emissions. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we can do about those orange bands, the actions that we're proposing here in the climate action plan, and that we'll be discussing here in just a few minutes, related to buildings and energy, center around four main goals. And here is the first goal, which is in a way is the most important, and that is to electrify essentially all buildings as quickly as we can, and by 2030 if possible. So primarily this would involve switching existing buildings from direct fossil fuel combustion for heating, for space and water heating, to using efficient electric options, so essentially zeroing their emissions. And primarily one of the main ways we'd be looking to do this is by encouraging technologies such as electric heat pumps, which has really seen a lot of growth in development recently. And just pointing out some of the benefits of heat pumps is that they're typically 25 to 50% more efficient than other electric heat forms. They're cheaper than heating oil and comparable price-wise over the life of the system to natural gas. And you get the added benefit of having air conditioning built in. So it's essentially an air conditioner that works two ways. And so, if we think about having more frequent extreme heat events or in wildfire smoke events where we're stuck inside, a strategy like heat pumps becomes increasingly important. But since we can't currently require all electric single family construction, we will have to continue to advocate for that ability. But in the meantime, we'll have to consider providing incentives or disincentives to encourage new single family homes to be built all electric instead of choosing fossil fuel options. So there's some strategies related to potential incentives for new all electric homes and disincentives for fossil fuel heating systems. But for existing homes, we'll really need to try to provide resources for residents to make that switch, focusing especially on assistance for lower income residents, and we'll want to combine that with efficiency programs to help lower bills. And then for existing commercial buildings, we can promote existing financing programs like CPACER that I mentioned, and that's a great opportunity to bundle with efficiency projects and to encourage renewable solar and EVs as well. Next slide, please. And then, so here are the other three strategies. So the second area is efficiency. So we will continue to push for more efficient state energy codes and commercial codes locally. We want to look at providing assistance, especially for older and low income households, to weatherize and save costs. And for large buildings, we could consider adopting something like a benchmarking or tune-ups requirement that's more stringent than what has been passed at the state level. The next third area is to continue to increase local renewable energy generation and expand equitable access to renewable energy. This is something we could do potentially through code incentives for solar, supporting community solar projects. Those are developments, solar installations on larger buildings that residents who maybe aren't able to install one on their own home or an apartment or who live in an apartment building can purchase a portion of the renewable energy generated by that project. There's also anaerobic digestion and biogas that has both regional and distributed small scale options that we could look at piloting. And we want to lead the way with continuing to incorporate renewables into city facilities. Lastly, so while we are focused largely on emissions in the Climate Action Plan, we do want to continue to support and encourage other sustainable building practices. So this fourth strategy is sort of a catch-all for those other types of sustainable practices that we want to see in buildings. And that could include things like water efficiency, water harvesting and reuse, or green stormwater, or smarter site design, to really ensure that new buildings are meeting a holistic environmental standard. And with that, that was a ton of information. So I think I want to pause and take any questions that there are related to the building and waste, or excuse me, the building and energy portion. And I do just want to mention, I have Ray Allshouse here. He's our building official with the city of Shoreline. So if we have more code related questions that are above my depth, we can have Ray jump in here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. Yeah, so any questions related to the content that Cameron just walked through today, just momentarily, just a few moments ago? And feel free to put them. We've got a couple of questions coming in the chat, and then also feel free to raise your hand as well if you'd like to verbally share your question. So we have a question from Trina in Echo Park. What is green stormwater?
Great question, and yeah, thanks for calling out our government speak lingo here. Green stormwater infrastructure it refers to things like rain gardens or green roofs or cisterns. There's a host of different practices that we can use to manage essentially rainwater runoff more naturally, as opposed to some more traditional ways like sending it into a pipe, into a ditch, or a catch basin that would have more environmental impacts. So it's kind of green stormwater infrastructure mimics what nature does naturally, gets it to soak into the soil.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question here from Courtney from Richmond Beach. How are greenhouse gas emissions measured, and how often in a year are they measured?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we just measured them for Shoreline. We've done these inventories about every 4 to 5-ish years. So our last one was in 2016. Prior to this 2019, we used 2019 data for this inventory. And it's really a very involved process. It involves getting a lot of different data from different city departments, but also from all the different utility providers. And so it's a pretty involved process. That's why we don't do it. We just don't have the capacity or time to do it every year. So it happens currently on about a 4 to 5 year cycle.
Thanks, Cameron. Got a hand up from Will.
Yeah, so this is kind of a couple questions, but I figured it was something that was good to kind of help stimulate the conversation. So with the urban heat island effect happening in dense development with concrete in areas where there's a reduction of trees, we will continue to have higher temperatures in these urban centers. With the climate change that is happening in the 100-degree temperatures that we saw last summer, it seems like it's never been more important to maintain trees and dense forests that we're all lucky to have in the area. This is especially true with the development of the Shoreline Place where Sears is. There's a large concern that it will continue to increase the temperature in the area. And with that increased heat, that means that air conditioners are having to run harder. And this is also requiring additional energy and putting a larger strain on the power grid. And this additional heat, I think, disproportionately affects seniors and other people of a lower income in the area who don't have the ability to install air conditioning. Is there a consideration to keep single-family zoning for homes nearby shoreline place where there's a huge amount of 100-year-old trees that cannot be replaced once they're gone? Seems these trees are vital to cleaning the air, especially with the increased wildfire smoke and other pollutants. These trees also prevent the pollution through storm weather runoff. These new developments seem to be kind of an issue. So I'm wondering if there's kind of a holistic approach to the zoning, especially in these areas by shoreline place.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah.
So just a recap of the question there, question about single family zoning and if that's part of the mix in terms of strategies and solutions.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Will. That's a great point, and I think I do just want to acknowledge. So we'll be talking specifically about this issue as it relates to urban heat and trees in particular in the March 30th workshop. So I don't want to steal too much thunder from that, and want to keep it pretty focused on the buildings and energy here. But I will say, yeah, I'm probably not the best to answer the zoning question in particular, but I do just want to say, if we think about a spot like Shoreline Place, which was developed, I believe, back in the 1950s, it's a huge, as you're aware, it's a huge swath of asphalt, basically, with very little landscaping. Our current code has come so much further than where, those codes were when that was first built. So, we do require more types of landscaping and mitigation, and for stormwater as well. So yeah, I think let's, if you don't mind, put a pin in that conversation but definitely want to dive into it in more detail in the March 30th workshop.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a few other questions here in the chat. We've got a comment from Lisa wanting to learn more about how to implement using gray water in our home and neighborhood. Would love links to learn more. Then we have a question from Laura. Are there any incentives for adaptive reuse of existing buildings instead of all new construction, where the materials used generate greenhouse gases during manufacturing?
That's a great question, and I'm going to have to get back to you on that. Yeah, I'll have to do a little more research, but I know that's something we are having conversations about.
Great, thank you. And then from Teresa, curious to know if Shoreline is considering actions to reduce greenhouse gases / embodied carbon related to building materials.
Yeah, embodied carbon is another strategy that we don't have a ton in this particular draft list, but it's something, yeah, we're considering for city projects. It's something we do have some policy around, but I think there's some room to look at that and see if there's places we can encourage that in the community as well. I'm also not familiar, so through the Deep Green Incentive Program, those programs and the certifications that we require for the different tiers are very comprehensive. So they, they're very holistic and cover everything from stormwater and site planning to energy and materials. So I don't know the particulars, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some embodied carbon aspects to those programs.
We've got a question from Nancy. With new construction building in downpours of rain using various types of plywood in construction, what protects the plywood from water intrusion and later toxic mold infestations?
That's a great question. That's probably more for somebody on the construction side. And yeah.
Do you want me to jump in on that, Cameron?
Sure. Yeah, Ray, you probably have experience with that.
Right, because this is a major concern, and it has been for a number of years, because one of the aspects of the energy code is basically to improve the efficiency of the building envelope, that which keeps the weather out and conserves energy. And so, that goes hand in hand with making sure that indoor air quality is maintained. So there are a number of measures that are taken even during construction, to make sure that before buildings are actually sealed up, that they've taken specific steps. This is even down to single family residences, to make sure that buildings are dried out so that moisture is not trapped in them. And the requirements for the term rain screens and what have you. It's how the building envelope keeps the rain out, but also there's another aspect of that, and that is to control, since moisture doesn't go away, moisture is in the air. And so buildings, particularly walls, are designed in such a fashion that in those instances, because it happens in each season where you get condensation, which occurs in a wall, if it's trapped, it is potentially could create mold. So there are specific measures that are taken in construction and how the walls are put together so that they one, breathe, and also any water that is in the wall is given a route out. And that's sort of a quick explanation, but to tell you that in new construction, it's a very important factor, and it's paid, a great deal of attention is paid to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ray. We do have a couple more questions about heat pumps, and then there's another question in here about incentive programs for changing to electric hot water tanks. So we are capturing all these questions, saving the chat, and we'll respond to them at a later time. So thank you all for these great questions coming in. And with that, we are going to launch our poll. As I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation when we kicked off tonight's conversation, really want to hear from you all in terms of your preference for where you want to go for a breakout room, and whether it's buildings and energy, or it's consumption and waste. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and launch the poll. And if you can just let us know, and this is going to give on the back end, the folks that are setting up the rooms, just a little bit of time to get those breakout rooms ready to go and ready to launch as we're presenting the consumption and waste portion of this presentation. So let's go ahead and launch the poll. And if you can let us know your preference. If you don't have a preference, also please let us know that. That's one of the options in the poll as well.
Gretchen, the poll is launched. This is Brent.
Great.
As a co-host, you don't see it though. That's
okay. Perfect.
So we have 26 people responding. I think there's 31 available.
Great. We'll give folks another 30 seconds to take the poll, and we'll put you in a room if we don't hear from you, assuming that a no response is you don't have a preference. And it looks like one person isn't seeing the poll. Brent, any thoughts on that? We can also have Amaya, we see you, and if you have a preference, if you want to just put it in the chat, that would be great too. So we're gonna keep us moving here. All right, how are we doing on the poll? We able to close it?
20, yeah, we had 28 respondents, and then anybody else can put it in the chat.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to turn it right back over to Cameron for a deep dive into consumption and waste.
All right. Yeah, so shifting gears to a totally different topic. So as I mentioned, the climate action plan will also include a focus area related to waste and consumption. And some of you who have elected to will be discussing these actions in your breakout room tonight. Next slide, please. So in terms of emissions, waste disposal is a small portion of our direct emissions here in Shoreline. So as you can see, it's that bright blue, it's about 2%. And we've made really great progress since 2009. We've reduced the emissions from waste by 56%, largely through more composting and recycling. And the biggest emissions related to waste come from food and compostable items like paper, when those primarily when those decompose anaerobically, such as in a landfill without oxygen, and release methane gas, which is a potent greenhouse gas. But there are some emissions associated with composting itself, but it's far less. And And we do also have a landfill gas collection system at the King County landfill where our garbage is sent. So it's actually that landfill gas is captured and piped back into PSE's pipeline. However, our emissions that we measured, so these direct emissions, as I mentioned earlier, they don't account for the full impact of consumption because they don't include the sort of embodied emissions from the production of those goods and services that may be occurring elsewhere in the world, unless they occurred in shoreline, and then we can measure the, have the energy use associated with that. And that's very significant, right? And then as we think about all of the different resources that are embodied in a product, if that product gets wasted before the end of its useful life, then you're wasting all of the other resources that went into that. So there really are huge societal, economic, and environmental costs associated with waste beyond just the direct emissions that we can capture here. So that's why we did want to talk about it. It's why it's something we need to keep working on as a community. Next slide, please. And so just some of the progress and opportunities that we've seen here. So in 2017, we started a new contract with Recology for the citywide recycling and garbage collection and processing. And we included free recycling for all customers in that. And we also included free or embedded composting for single family customers in that. So we've seen a lot of improvements just through that contract structure. We also implemented a construction and demolition debris recycling ordinance. So as some of you pointed out, sort of the material aspect of buildings, that's one of the connection points here is that we have an ordinance on the book to require that when certain demolition activities are being undertaken, that they have to attempt to divert some of that material that may still be usable to different uses. And then as I mentioned, the King County Cedar Hills Regional Landfill, which you can see here in the top photo, sort of ironically just juxtaposed with our beautiful Mount Rainier. It's literally a mountain of garbage, and it is a very nice landfill, as the landfill gas collection I mentioned, but it's also filling up. We have only about 7 years left at our current disposal rates for the life of that landfill. And other options will be significantly more expensive and may have different environmental benefits or aspects to consider. So the King County is working currently on a RePlus plan, which is really targeted towards how can we achieve zero waste of resources sent to landfill by 2030. And then there's also some significant state legislation that's being looked at. Currently, there's an organics bill on the governor's desk that would look to improve composting. And then there are ongoing efforts related to a policy known as extended producer responsibility that would actually require producers of packaging products to help fund the recycling and incentivize better, more recyclable product design. Next slide, please. And so here's how where the waste breaks out most recently from the data we have from Recology. So we sent, as a shoreline community, 52% of that material to landfill, 22% was recycled, and 26% was composted. And then you can see how that breaks out between single family homes, which had a higher overall diversion rate, apartments, just pointing out that apartments and businesses had a much lower rate of composting, but fairly comparable rates of recycling. And again, it's a cost for them to subscribe to compost service, where it's not a cost for single family homes. Next slide, please. And then every so often, King County does a look at what is in our garbage, what are we sending to the landfill? And most recently, I think this is also 2019 data, they found that 70% of what gets sent to Cedar Hills is readily recyclable or compostable, or 62%, excuse me, was easily recyclable or compostable, and then another 8% has some limited markets or future markets. So fully 70% of the garbage we have better homes for already, better uses, it has economic value. And so we want to really to get those materials out of the landfill and put them back to use in the economy. Next slide, please. And just to mention that this is the concept of a waste hierarchy. So recycling, composting are great, but they're only a couple steps above disposal, right? So if we prevent that waste from happening in the first place, you're saving all of the other resources that I mentioned that went into producing that product. And then, taking steps to reduce waste or reuse products in a different way are all have greater environmental and social benefits before we get to recycling, which is one of the steps, just above disposal. Next slide. And we also, all of this, we really want to encourage a transition from this sort of linear model where we're extracting resources, making something, and it's just designed to be disposed of at the end of its life. We want to move to circular economy, to this idea of circularity, where products become, the inputs into the system, and they're really designed with that in mind. Next slide. And so here's the goals and just high level of the strategies we're looking at in the CAP related to waste and consumption. They are pretty straightforward. So the first one is to keep working on waste prevention. So trying to reduce that per capita waste generation before we even get to recycling and composting. So that's things, and especially focusing on food waste, since we know from a climate perspective, it's the food and compostables that have the biggest impact. In food, we also think about sort of the equity concerns and just the social impact of diverting food from a waste to a beneficial use, getting food to people who need it. So working on education related to food waste prevention, supporting food rescue. We can host or support repair events, which are things we've seen across the county, and look at even more sort of involved. A deconstruction ordinance would be looking at actually requiring buildings to be dismantled and the useful materials reused. Then the second two goals are related to increasing composting and recycling rates and expanding access to those services. So we know, it's not required for certain things to be recycled or composted. So we can look at requiring that or subsidizing it, such as composting at food businesses or apartment properties where we know there's not a lot of composting currently going on. But we also want to provide equitable access to those services to make sure we have, in language and culturally appropriate education and communications materials so that all of our community has the opportunity to participate. And then we can continue to support extended producer responsibility and other legislation at the state level. And I think I'll leave it there for waste. Do we have time for a couple questions, Gretchen? Or if not, I can take them in the breakout room.
Yeah, let's see if there are any questions from the group. So any questions, feel free to raise your hand and or put them in the chat. Any questions on this portion of the presentation? We've got one from Lee. Does the Shoreline Council plan to offer free recycle services to increase apartment recycle rates?
So it is currently free for apartments, for businesses, for all of Shoreline Recycling is free in the sense that it's included in the cost of garbage service.
Thanks, Cameron. We've got a hand up from Trina.
What is pilot and anaerobic digester?
Great question. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot to mention it, but there's technology. I mentioned when organic waste breaks down anaerobically, typically that's a bad thing. But if you do it in a controlled environment, there's facilities that are basically, some are large scale, like similar to a wastewater treatment plant, and they actually break that material down. It's kind of like composting, but on a different scale, different process. But all of the gas is captured. So you get a biogas product that's essentially can be used as fuel or to heat buildings, produced from the organic waste, and it also creates a sort of a fertilizer byproduct that can be used, for farms or agricultural applications.
Thank you.
And there's also smaller scale facilities that, can basically fit in like kind of a shipping pod and can, work for institutional campuses and things like that.
Thanks, Cameron. We've got a hand up from Courtney.
Hi, Cameron. I have a question. I'm wondering if you all have heard of this company.
Courtney, your audio is a bit hard to understand. I'm not sure what's going on your end. It might be worth it to just put your question in the chat. We're not able to hear you, Courtney.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. So Cameron, I was wondering if y'all have heard of a company called Ridwell. the awesome thing about it is every other week they'll come pick up hard to recycle items from your house. The downside is, of course, it's a monthly payment, but so that kind of goes into the equity thing. And also you could also drive to multiple places to drop off each of these hard to recycle items. So that's a carbon footprint thing. So I'm wondering if Shoreline would ever consider subsidizing for lower income households so that they could, maybe a partnership with Ridwell.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. So a couple things. Recology does have a special item collection, so it doesn't cover as many things as Ridwell's list,
right? Yeah.
But they do provide that already, a pickup service for their customers. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, you can drive around. There are a lot of options. Obviously, there's transportation associated with that. But yeah, no, Ridwell's, we're in touch with them. We've been talking about different pilots with them. So that's definitely, yeah, something you can consider. Thanks for bringing it up.
Awesome, thanks.
Then we have time for two final questions. One is a question, there are two questions in the chat related to this about composting be provided for apartments for free. So is that a consideration, or is that something that people should be bringing into the discussion questions as a potential strategy in action?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so yeah, one of the actions is to consider either requiring it for those properties or subsidizing it in some way. There are a couple different models that we could look at from different cities, and we're piloting this right now with restaurants in Shoreline. So we're subsidizing it for restaurants on a pilot basis, and it's something we're also looking to do on a pilot basis for apartment properties over the next year. So yeah, definitely considering it, but yeah, please bring these suggestions to the breakouts as well.
Great. And then time for this final question here from Teresa. How is the food waste in schools? Is this an area to improve in Shoreline and perhaps share tables or donation program?
Yeah, schools are big. There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of cool project ideas with schools. I think I've seen things with, like bulk milk dispensers, helping cut down on wasted milk. There's all different things. Yeah, share tables, as you mentioned. I don't have a good sense of what is already being implemented across the Shoreline School District. I do know that I believe the majority of their campuses do have composting service, so that's good. But there may be significant opportunity to continue to increase, especially food waste prevention.
Great. Excellent. And then there is one final question in here before we move into getting the breakout rooms figured out and you all oriented into what is about to happen. They've already been set up on the back end, ready to launch. We are going to walk through a few slides here in just a moment about the discussion format for the night. But this final question that we're going to get to, is there any talk of Recology or other vendors expanding curbside to include styrofoam, plastic bags, and other hard to recycle items?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Recology store does take styrofoam. I don't think, I should know this, I don't think their pickup service takes it where you can call in and schedule a special item pickup. And yeah, plastic bags are one we're aware of, and one that, we've been talking to Ridwell and talking to Recology about how can we get more diversion, since, a lot of the education has been focused on getting those out of the recycling. So there are take back options at the different grocery stores and the Shoreline transfer station, as you mentioned. But yeah, we want to look for ways we can expand that and make that service more accessible.
Great, thank you. And then there's a response from Teresa to that question as well in the chat. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Excellent. So now we're moving into the interactive portion of the night, and you'll be given the option in just a moment on your screen to head right into a breakout room. And we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So you'll see we are here. So we're going to be transitioning to breakout rooms in just a moment. You'll be hearing from several different facilitators. So these will be facilitated discussions. And I'll be introducing you to each of the facilitators that will be facilitating one of the 6 breakout rooms that we have in just a moment. So we'll be heading into our breakout rooms, and then we'll be doing a deep dive with each of you during this interactive session, getting your input on the strategies and actions related to one of the 2 focus areas that we covered today. And then we'll be transitioning back into the main room and we'll be doing a report out so that you'll hear some of the highlights and key elements from each of the discussions in the other breakout rooms that you were not in. And with that, we can go ahead to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, each breakout room will cover one focus area and the associated actions, strategies, and actions within that focus area. And you just took a poll and chose the focus to focus either on buildings and energy or consumption and waste. A few of you said that it didn't matter. And so we assigned each of you with your preference in mind. And today's discussion will focus on hearing your feedback to help refine the plan's buildings and energy and consumption and waste actions. And before we head into the breakout rooms, I wanted to introduce our full team of facilitators. So Cameron and I will both be facilitating 2 of the breakout rooms. We also have Bethany, Eric, and Constance from the City of Shoreline who will be facilitating breakout rooms. And we have Alicia from Cascadia who will also be facilitating one of the breakout rooms. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, okay, transition to breakout rooms. So in just a moment, you have been pre-assigned and we'll be using Mural. So when you get into your breakout room, the facilitator will take a moment just to get everything set up. They'll be sharing their screen, and the Mural platform, it's basically an online version of sticky notes and flip charts when we used to meet in person. And so we'll be capturing the conversation that way on Mural, and we'll be in the breakout rooms for approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll be reconvening as a full group. Any questions about the breakout rooms before we transition in there? Okay, great. So with that, Haley, let us know when we're ready to go, and we look forward to the conversations that we'll each be having in the breakout rooms.
We're all good. Have fun.
Great. Excellent. Welcome back, everybody. We are going to do a quick report out across the various different rooms here, and we're going to go ahead and share highlights. Each of the facilitators are going to share a brief set of highlights related to the conversation that you just had in your breakout room. And Cameron, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks Gretchen, and thanks to my group. Had some really awesome conversations, a couple themes emerging. So we were talking about the waste and consumption strategies, and we spent a lot of time on waste reduction, really talking about food waste and a lot of like at grocery stores and different places that serve hot food, and just ways, knowing that there's a lot of waste that happens there, and there's a lot of even local food donation programs. So how can we sync that up better and ensure that that waste is at a minimum getting composted, but ideally getting diverted to good use. A lot about partnering with businesses and really helping them compost and recycle more because of that being a big gap. And some actions, and increasing access to special item recycling services. There's a lot of different options, but trying to make it easy and accessible to folks. And then related to people living in apartments or places where they don't have access to compost, can we provide some community drop-off locations or other arrangements, maybe at pea patches where people can compost their food waste?
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Cameron. We'll hop over to room 3 and Bethany.
Thank you. So again, thank you to my group for participating. It was a real easy process and the time flew by. So just to summarize our discussion, I would say that the group was generally positive for all of the actions that were listed. They really were enthusiastic about incentives or rebates that would be available. There were some comments about like a conversion program one of the participants participated in a few years ago to convert her home, and just how helpful that was to kind of bring it all in one easy kind of package. And another theme was about ethical sourcing of like for batteries, just some concerns about where the materials come from. And then ensuring equity in all programming, just making sure that there are ways to get all groups involved in that, and to make sure there's maybe even incentives for particular groups. And then also looking, one concern area was looking for more ways to include pre-existing family homes there's a lot of talk about changing building codes for new construction and new building, but what can we do for the folks that are interested in it and are living in single family homes? So that's a summary from group 3.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bethany. And moving right on to breakout room 4 and Constance.
We had a really great group, very, very community focused, and information sharing in terms of wanting that to happen more than anything, that before people actually run up against needing to replace their furnace or something in their house, that they have enough information ahead of time to be able to make good choices, because a contractor coming in is unlikely to direct them to greener choices. It would just be like, oh, your furnace is out, let's just replace it with something similar. So the importance of the city having information regularly, maybe in currents, focusing on like replacement or how people can make other choices would be really important. We also talked a lot, or the group talked a lot about the importance for people to share information with each other, that there needs to be a volunteer kind of network within Shoreline where people who have had a heat pump installed would be willing to share that information to kind of coach people. And the same with solar. And then we really focused on how you change people's attitudes about things, that there has to be some behavioral change. And somebody suggested that if the city has access to psychologists to change how we change attitudes, that would be really important. And that was really focused on lawns, actually, and the waste of water and the use of pesticides. Came up with a really great idea for shaming people who have green lawns. So it was a very creative discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Constance. We'll go to Eric and then Alicia, and then we'll wrap up with my group.
Yeah, it was a great discussion as with the others. And again, general support for all the actions. I think one thing, or a number of things, there's a lot of energy around solar energy and talking about solar and how trying to figure out different ways we can make that work, making sure that, you know, for homes that can't have solar, what are their options, or can we create the community solar? So definitely energy around that. We also had some discussions around the electrical grid. If we're all moving to electricity, what does that mean for the electrical grid, and how can we make sure that you know, we're keeping an eye on that? We also some other groups talked about this. We want to make sure we're focusing on existing homes, not just new homes, but also existing homes and multifamily homes as well. And then lastly, there's a number of people that said, for the ones about the city doing stuff, the city should be a model, and we really should be trumpeting some of the work we're doing, but we also need to step up some of our own timelines and making sure that we are the model for the city. And finally, education is extremely important, and educating people about this issue and that we can all do our part. It's overwhelming, but we can all do something.
Thanks, Eric. Alicia?
Great. A lot of overlap, but some of the main themes from my breakout group included generally being supportive of the goals, and also discussing the need in some places for more regulation or changes to codes. We talked through some of the challenges around retrofitting existing homes, and then discussed more fundamentally the overall energy grid system, and there was a lot of support for decentralized, localized energy production.
Great, thanks, Alicia. And then similarly in my group, a lot of support across the actions, although they did note we added a lot of concerns, but it wasn't because of lack of support for the actions, but just wanting to highlight some of the things that warranted further discussion and wanted to be highlighted in the concerns category. Also, any requirements that have financial implication, having a really need to come with financial support to address equity considerations. And a lot of interest around the learning more about the true costs to converting, whether it's your home from from natural gas to electric, what is the true cost of that, both from a conversion standpoint and then from a monthly cost standpoint versus and the benefit. And so sharing that education opportunity, and then making sure that we're not putting the burden on people at a financial disadvantage to get the information. So recognizing that not everybody could come to a conversation like we had tonight, bringing the information to them versus expecting people to come to us for the information. And then a lot of support for things like community solar, because that is something you don't need to be a homeowner to do, and you can pay into. And so a lot of interest around things that aren't just for homeowners, but are for others as well. So around that inclusivity piece. So in terms of next steps, now we're right at 8 o'clock here. We just have a couple of next steps to report out to you all. So what happens next? We will be summarizing this conversation as well as posting the recording up on the project website, which you see right here on your screen. And also Haley just put in the chat. We've got our 4th community conversation on March 30th around sequestration and resiliency, so trees and ecosystems and community preparedness. So please come to that. We look forward to engaging with you all then as well. Please tell your friends to come as well. And then an early summer community climate conversation to review the draft action list. So that will be our final, that's when we're moving into phase 3 of the project. And that'll be the final opportunity as part of this effort to hear from the community on that final list of draft actions. And at any moment, if you all do have any additional feedback that you want to share about this process, about the conversation that we had today, to please let us know. And we can go ahead and put Cameron's information right there in the chat. On the website, the project website, you can sign up for any project updates, and we still have a survey open. So if you haven't taken that survey yet, please take a moment to do so. Thank you all so much for being here on your Wednesday night and spending 2 hours with us, diving deeply into these really important and timely topics. Have a wonderful night and a wonderful rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you on March 30th. Thank you all so much.